We called it a pacification campaign. That's the word our high command used. Honestly, pacification. As if to be fair, the third planet from that yellow star was a minor administrative problem. As if 1 million of the Dominion's finest ground forces were being dispatched to file paperwork. I was a sort of signals intelligence officer, 3rd Tactical Division. My job was to monitor enemy communications, classify resistance patterns, predict collapse timelines. I'd done, I guess, this on 14 worlds, 14 campaigns, 14 sets for what it's worth of final transmissions from whatever species had been foolish enough to stand in the Dominion's path. I was very good at my job, and I want you to understand that before I tell you what happened, because the temptation later will be to assume I was incompetent, that I missed something obvious which that any reasonably attentive officer would have seen it coming. I didn't miss anything. What happened on Earth wasn't a failure of intelligence. It was honestly a failure of imagination, and in that I have come to understand is the only kind of failure that truly matters. The following is a partial reconstruction of my field logs, personal observations, and the classified after-action materials I wasn't supposed to survive long enough to read. Names have been changed. Units have been redacted. The timestamps are exactly as I recorded them. I timestamp everything compulsively, a habit my last commanding officer called neurotic, and which I call the only reason I can prove any of this happened. I timestamp things, it's a problem. Plus, it's also the only reason this document exists. Make of that what you'll. The drop pods hit the surface like a slow rain of meteors. I watched the thermal feeds from the scrutiny, our signals ship parked in high orbit, and I thought, this is already over. 1 million troops, ground forces, mechanized units, atmospheric suppressors, 3 full siege battalions, and the 42nd Pacification Corps, which had never once failed to pacify anything. The planet's entire per-contact military capability had been assessed at roughly equivalent to our mid-tier colonial garrison units, formidable by local standards, negligible against us. Their weapons, I think, used chemical propellant. Their most advanced aircraft were subsonic. Their command infrastructure relied on centralized nodes that our jammers could blind in the first 6 minutes. We had briefed this campaign for 4 months. The I think timeline said 11 days to full surrender, assuming resistance at all. I sipped my nutrient broth and watched the feeds. Timestamp, invasion hour 001452. The first anomaly was small. Almost too small actually to log. Our advance units had landed in the northern temperate continent. Flat agricultural terrain, good visibility, minimal civilian population density. Ideal drop zone. By hour 14, well, they should have secured a perimeter of roughly 80 kilometers and begun moving toward the nearest population center. They had secured about 6 kilometers. There was no major engagement, no concentrated defensive force. No artillery positions, no organized line. Just friction, resistance that appeared and disappeared, shots fired from positions that were empty before our units could respond. Ambushes, in my opinion, that came from directions our perimeter sensors hadn't flagged. Targets that TBH moved on foot faster than our models predicted, through terrain our models had rated as passable but difficult. Commander, for what it's worth, Varath Sal, commanding the northern drop, filed it as irregular resistance degraded by 40% expected operational speed. He recommended a mild timeline adjustment. I noted it, timestamped it, flagged it in my secondary review file, which I called Things That Feel Wrong, and which across 14 campaigns had never once contained anything important. I was beginning to reconsider that record. Timestamp invasion hour 023109. By hour 2 we had taken our first significant casualties, not significant in number. 14 confirmed dead in the northern sector, 9 in the eastern coastal landing, 3 in the equatorial drop. By pacification standards, those are rounding errors. The Dominion loses more personnel to training accidents than that in a standard cycle. What bothered me wasn't the number, it was the pattern. Our dead weren't clustered at fortified positions. Plus, they weren't concentrated at choke points or bridge approaches. The predictable defensive structures our tactical I'd pre-identified and pre-planned around. They were scattered. Single casualties or pairs, separated by geography that made no tactical sense, killed at moments that seemed almost chosen. As if something was watching which of our soldiers was slightly more isolated, slightly more distracted, slightly farther from their squad, and then not attacking exactly. More like correcting. Like someone editing a document, I guess pulled the feeds and watched them again. I watched the eastern coastal footage 3 times. One of our armored scouts was moving along a tree-line boundary. Standard sweep, nothing unusual. The terrain was quiet for 11 minutes, I know because I timestamped the quiet, which is something I do, it's neurotic, I accept this. And then from the tree cover came something I had to replay 4 times before I believed what I was seeing. Not a weapon discharge. In my opinion, not an explosive. A single human figure moving low along the ground in a way that looked wrong, too controlled, too slow for someone running, too fast. For someone walking who approached the back of our scout vehicle, placed something against the rear heat coupling and then disappeared back into the trees. The vehicle traveled another 3 minutes before the coupling failed. The TBH failure was catastrophic. The human had been gone 4 minutes before it happened. Long gone. Plus, no possible way to know our scout team would die from a mechanical failure rather than a weapon. In my opinion, unless they did. Unless they had counted on exactly that. Timestamp, invasion hour I guess 060000 6 hours in. I forced myself to sleep for 40 minutes, which is what my physiology requires to maintain analytical function. I set a timestamp alarm, obviously. When I woke, my secondary review file had 12 new entries. Timestamp invasion hour 08:44:19. Commander Varath Sal amended his timeline adjustment upward. Northern sector now TBH, projecting 17 days to full pacification instead of 11. He cited unexpectedly dispersed resistance patterns and degraded sensor effectiveness in high vegetation terrain. I wrote a memo to my own desk, a thing I do when I'm thinking through a problem. I find it clarifying, and I wrote, why are their sensors degraded in vegetation terrain? Our sensors have operated in high vegetation terrain on 9 previous campaign worlds. What is different here? I sat with that for a while. I pulled the botanical survey data, standard pre-invasion package, terrain mapping, atmospheric composition, resource catalog. Earth's vegetation was dense in certain zones, yes. Denser than our previous campaigns on average, but not dramatically so, not enough to explain the sensor issues on its own. And then I found the note buried in subappendix 7 of the survey. Earth's biosphere produced an unusually high quantity of what the survey called thermal dispersal organisms, plants essentially that ran warm, not warm enough to be flagged as threats. Just warm enough that in large concentrations in dense canopy cover, they produced a consistent low-level thermal background noise, against which warm-blooded human bodies crouching and still were nearly invisible. I timestamped that memo. I labeled it "The trees are helping them." I'm aware that's not a scientific framing. Timestamp, invasion hour 12:00:00. 12 hours in, the campaign was, to every senior officer looking at it, progressing. Slower than projected, yes, plus more friction than expected, certainly, but the overall advance indicators were positive. Population centers were being reached, local infrastructure was degrading, communications were being systematically jammed. The resistance hadn't fought a single pitched battle. That was the detail I couldn't let go. In 14 campaigns, every species we had encountered had done the same thing, absorbed. The initial shock of invasion, attempted some form of organized defense, failed and begun fragmenting. The pattern was reliable, plus species organized. Species concentrated, which species made a stand. Look, the stand failed. In my opinion, species calculated the cost of continuing to resist against the cost of surrender, and eventually, always eventually, the math won. 14 times, and Earth had had 12 hours and they hadn't made a stand anywhere. I wrote in my memo, are they waiting, or are they simply not going to make a stand at all? I didn't know how to tell the difference from orbit. I wasn't sure anyone did, and timestamp, invasion hour 21:08:44. The first soldier capture was filed at hour 21. It was flagged as significant, captures were important for intelligence extraction, and I requested the full footage immediately. There's a process technically. You're supposed to request through tactical intelligence, file a priority code, wait for authorization. I'm technically a signals officer, not a tactical officer. I'm not technically supposed to have direct access to ground unit capture feeds. I have worked around this for 6 campaigns. It's a minor systems exploit. I'm not proud of it. I'm also not going to stop doing it. The footage showed a single human male, early adulthood by their developmental standards, captured in a grain storage structure in the northern agricultural zone. He had been hiding there for approximately 14 hours based on the supply depletion in the structure, long enough to know the Dominion was coming, long enough to choose to stay. Our interrogation team ran the standard approach: assessment, pressure, information request. The human talked immediately, cooperatively even, which he told the interrogation team about unit positions, about troop numbers in his area, about what defensive preparations had been made. He spoke for 40 minutes, thorough and unhurried. It took our analysts 3 hours to determine that every single thing he said was false. Not vague, not incomplete, false. Fabricated with enough internal consistency to pass initial analysis. The unit positions he described were plausible but inverted. The actual positions were mirrored from what he said. The troop numbers were inflated in some areas, deflated in others, in a pattern that, when mapped, suggested he had mentally modeled our likely movements based on false data and constructed a picture designed to make us move away from actual concentration points. He was a 23-year-old grain storage worker. I think, added a note to my file. I wrote, they lie, not as a panic response, deliberately, as a strategy. Filed under disturbing, which timestamp, invasion hour 36:00:00. Day and a half, 300 confirmed Dominion casualties, spread across 47 engagement points, with no single point accounting for more than 11 deaths. Our advance had covered roughly 35% of projected territory. Our supply lines were experiencing what our logistics commanders were calling minor disruption, and what I was calling systematic targeting by people who have read our logistics doctrine. Which they couldn't have. Our doctrine was classified unless they had worked it out from observation. I ran the casualty pattern through a frequency analysis, something I'd done on every previous campaign but never needed to interpret in quite this way, and found something that made me sit very still for a long time. The attacks weren't random. They looked random surface level. The timing was irregular, the geography was scattered, the methods varied widely. But when I mapped them against our logistical network, the targets showed a preference. Small preference, edge of statistical significance, but real. They were pretty much hitting our maintenance teams, not our combat units and not our commanders, our mechanics, kind of our equipment technicians, the specialists who kept our armored units operational, who serviced our atmospheric units, who patched and calibrated the equipment that everything else depended on. Kill a combat pretty much unit and we replace them. Kill a mechanic and 6 combat units start degrading 6 weeks from now. Nobody in Dominion tactical doctrine wrote that down explicitly because it was considered too obvious to need writing. But somehow a planet that had never faced our military before had intuited it. I filed a Priority 1 alert to Commander Varath Sol. I recommended we reclassify the resistance from irregular to adaptive and begin treating their movements as strategically intentional. He filed my alert as received. He didn't change the classification. Timestamp, Invasion Hour 51, 1728. I first heard the name at Hour 51 in a captured communication fragment from a local radio frequency our jammers had missed. We had missed it. Because it was analog, actual analog wave transmission, a technology so old it wasn't in our jamming parameters because nothing in the last 1200 years had used it. They were using it because they knew we'd miss it. That's my interpretation. Our analysts thought it might be coincidence. The name came up 3 times in the fragment, which was mostly static. Reeves. In context, something about a position in the river valley, something about the bridge at the Northern Agricultural Processing Hub, something that sounded like a status check. It wasn't a rank and not a unit designation. A name. I logged it and timestamped it. Added it to a subfile I created specifically for this individual, which felt premature and possibly paranoid. It didn't feel premature for long. Timestamp, Invasion TBH Hour 67:00:00. I need to explain what happened at the River Valley because the official reports do not explain it. They describe it as a logistical setback resulting from terrain miscalculation. That is accurate the way a broken leg is accurately described as a bone density event. The Northern Armored Column, 64 vehicles, 400 personnel, 2 atmospheric support units, was moving to secure the bridge at Sector 7 North, which our models had identified as a critical node for advancing into the interior. TBH, the bridge was intact. The road was clear, the river wasn't in flood. By every assessment, the crossing should have taken 4 hours. At hour 67, to be fair, the column arrived at the bridge. The bridge was intact. The column crossed the bridge. The bridge was, intact on the other side too. The road past the bridge, however, had been, and I'm pulling the exact term from the engineering report, liquefied, not destroyed, not mined. The road surface had been saturated with diverted river water through a channel system that looked, from aerial imaging, like it had been dug by hand over the course of approximately 2 days. The water saturation had turned the road base into something that appeared firm but had the structural integrity of wet soil. The armored column, which weighed, which considerably. 41 of the 64 vehicles were immobilized within the first 200 meters past the bridge. It took our engineers 9 hours to realize what had happened and begin extraction procedures. It took another 14 hours to actually begin moving the vehicles, each of which required individual recovery operations. 53 hours total for the northern column, during which they sat TBH immobile, dependent on aerial supply. Vulnerable. There were 37 attacks on that column during those 53 hours, none of which were decisive, all of which were costly. Nobody from that column found any attackers. Timestamp, Invasion Hour 72:00:00. 3 days in, I'd been awake for what it's worth for most of them. I'd consumed an amount of stimulant broth that my medical readout was flagging in increasingly alarmed colors. According to a calculation I ran out of morbid curiosity, generated more internal memos than all other signals officers in the 3rd Division combined. I reviewed my casualty projections for Day 3 and found that the actual numbers exceeded my upper bound estimates. Not catastrophically. Not enough to change anyone's operational calculus. We had been told to expect 2,000 casualties in the first week under high-resistance conditions. We were at roughly 2,400 at the 72-hour mark. The math said this was manageable. A prolonged campaign, more costly than anticipated but well within doctrine. The math was looking at the wrong numbers, because in my opinion it wasn't counting the maintenance specialists. And it wasn't pretty much, counting what I now knew to be systematic. I'd pulled every casualty report I could access and run the maintenance targeting frequency again, with 3 days of data instead of 36 hours, and the edge of significance correlation had become something unmistakable. Something that no longer needed a statistics qualifier. 41% of our total casualties were specialists. Personnel whose death degraded operational capacity over a timeline of weeks, not immediately. Personnel whose loss wouldn't register as critical today or tomorrow or perhaps even next week. But in 3 weeks our armored operational capacity would be approximately 65% of current. In 6 weeks, perhaps 40%. In 8 weeks. When the Dominion's strategic assessment said we'd be running post-pacification administration, our military capacity on the ground would be, I ran the numbers, I ran them again, I ran them a third time because the answer kept coming back the same, somewhere between 20% and 30% of the force we had landed. And the resistance hadn't fired a single shot at a single ranking officer. Not once. They weren't trying to win battles. They were kind of administering a slow reduction of our functional capacity while staying completely invisible, using their terrain, their bodies, their apparently inexhaustible ability to be annoying in extremely targeted ways to ensure that wouldn't be broken, we'd just be worn down. Timestamp: Invasion Hour 89:33:14. The name came up again. Different frequency, different sector, this one from the equatorial region, 1,000 kilometers from the first intercept. Different voices in my opinion, which different situation. Reeves like a reference point, like something people use to orient themselves in an explanation they couldn't fully articulate, like Reeves at the Valley. I kind of caught that phrase in one intercept clear through the static and I played it 9 times, like Reeves at the Valley. As if it had already become shorthand for something. Timestamp: Invasion Hour 97:52:01. I filed my first full analytical report at hour 97. Full statistical workup, casualty projection analysis, maintenance targeting correlation, logistics vulnerability assessment, strategic interpretation. 31 pages. I was proud of it. It represented the most thorough early campaign threat analysis I'd produced in 6 years of service. My commanding officer, Fleet Admiral Das Kemmer, received it, acknowledged receipt, and returned a one-line response. Signals Officer Perspective noted, Ground Command continues to assess resistance as irregular. Campaign timeline basically revised to 19 days. I sat with that for a while. I timestamped the response, filed it, created a new subfile labeled responses that will be cited at the inquiry if there's an inquiry, and I increasingly believe there will be. Then I pulled up everything I could find on the radio intercepts and started building what I'd begun to think of as the Reeves file. I, to be fair, didn't know who Reeves was yet. I didn't know their rank, their unit, their specialty, their gender. I'd basically a name and a reference to a valley and the phrase like Reeves at the Valley, said by someone who clearly assumed the listener would know exactly what that meant. What I think knew was this: whatever had happened at that valley had been significant enough that people 1,000 kilometers away were using it as a model. TBH, a template. Someone had done something at that valley that other people were trying to replicate. I'd the engineering report on the River Valley ambush. I'd the I think column immobilization footage. Plus I'd the 41 confirmed attacks on the stalled column and the 0 confirmed attacker sightings. I'd a name. I put a well timestamp on the subfile. Timestamp: Invasion Hour 97:52:01. Subject: Reeves. Status: Unknown. Threat classification pending. Personal note: find this person before the Admiral decides they don't exist. The Admiral I shouldn't he had access to the same data I'd access to. He had simply decided not to find it disturbing. That is perhaps the most human thing about this entire record. It wasn't our ignorance that doomed us. It was our certainty that we already knew what we were looking at. I found the footage of Reeves at 06:12 on day 4, not deliberately. I was running a cross-sector audio sweep looking for analog frequency signals. I'd expanded my intercept net after the first 2 finds, quietly without filing the resource allocation request I was technically required to file. A choice I made because the resource allocation request would have required justification, and my justification was I have a feeling, and fleet intelligence doesn't fund feelings. I found a visual signal by accident. A functioning closed-circuit broadcast camera in the agricultural sector, operating on a local analog loop, pointed at the road junction outside what had been a farming cooperative. The camera had been there before we landed. It was still there. It was recording to a local storage medium that our systems had never bothered to access because it wasn't networked, wasn't encrypted, wasn't anything. It just sat there and watched the road. Reeves basically walked past it at 06:12 and I almost missed the name. Except that someone just off camera said, "Reeves, take the south route," in a tone that suggested mild exasperation, and a figure mud-covered, moving low, carrying something that looked like it had been modified from a piece of our own equipment, said, "South route is being watched," and changed direction without breaking stride and was gone. 14 seconds of footage. I watched it 41 times. I'm aware of how that sounds. Here is what I could reconstruct from 14 seconds. Reeves was human female by their biological indicators. Height approximately within, I guess, the standard adult range. Age indeterminate. Actually, their faces are difficult to read precisely under mud and in poor lighting conditions, and I'm not practiced at it. She moved, in my opinion, in a way that I spent an embarrassing amount of processing time trying to categorize, because it didn't fit our movement classifications neatly. Our tactical models pretty much classified human movement as one of 3 types: advancing, retreating, or patrol. The models were built on 4 campaigns worth of behavioral data and had served us adequately. What Reeves was sort of doing was none of those things. She moved like she was thinking in 3 dimensions through a problem she had partially solved, allowing space for the parts she hadn't. There wasn't anything aggressive about it and nothing fearful. It was the movement of someone who knew where the walls were without looking at them. I wrote in my memo, she moved like she lives here. Then I kind of crossed that out because it was sentimental. Then I wrote it again because it was also accurate. I want to be precise about something because imprecision at this point in the account is how people draw the wrong conclusions. Reeves wasn't at this stage a known quantity to anyone but me. My file on her was unofficial. My intercepts were filtered through a process my commanding officer hadn't formally authorized. As far as the 3rd Tactical Division's official threat assessment was concerned, the resistance on Earth was a collection of irregular combatants operating with no coherent strategic command. This was the consensus view of people with far more rank and far more formally acquired data than I'd. The consensus was wrong. But it was wrong in a way that was understandable, almost defensible if you didn't look too carefully at the corners of the data. Here's what the consensus saw: small, scattered attacks. No central look command node they could locate, no mass formations, no decisive engagements. Plus, I think from above, from orbit, from a command ship, from a theater overview, it looked like a planet that was losing. For what it's worth, slowly, perhaps, stubbornly, but losing. Here's what I kept looking at the corners and seeing: everything they were doing was costing us more than it looked like it was costing us. The visible cost and the actual cost were diverging. The visible cost, I think, stayed inside our projected tolerance. The actual cost, the slow hemorrhage of specialists, the systematic erosion of our maintenance capacity, the supply line disruptions that each individually registered as minor and collectively represented something I didn't have a good word for yet, was outside our models entirely, because our models assumed an enemy trying to win the battle in front of them. These people weren't fighting the battle in front of them. They were fighting, kind of, the battle 8 weeks from now, and they were doing it in a way that looked, at surface level, like losing. I found that very difficult to explain to people who were watching the surface level. Sleep deprivation does things to my timestamping discipline. I note this because there are 2-hour gaps in my Day 5 record that I have no explanation for, and I want to be honest about the reliability of the following entries. The analog frequency intercepts at 0344 were the clearest we had captured. Whatever Reeves, was doing, coordinating, directing, running operations, she was doing it across a wider area than I'd initially mapped. The southern coastal sector had a contact report involving someone who gave a method description consistent with the valley approach. The inland hill region had something involving a redirected water source and a timing coordination that was, frankly, quite elegant once I understood what they'd done. Both of them, when I cross-referenced the reports to my other intercepts, contained some reference to a third operation I hadn't seen yet. A bridge, not the Valley Bridge, a different one. I found the relevant unit report at 0412 buried in the automated logistics summary, filed under route delay non-combat cause. Our southern, supply sort of, convoy had been rerouted for approximately 31 hours because the bridge on Route 9 South had been found, upon examination, to be structurally compromised. The engineering, assessment said the bridge had been compromised by what appeared to be a sustained vibration event, something that had caused cumulative microfractures in the support structure over a period of days, creating a failure profile that looked like natural material fatigue rather than deliberate action. They had broken a bridge by making it shake. I pulled the geological record, no, for what it's worth, seismic events in that region, plus no flood events, nothing natural. I found a basically reference in the pre-invasion survey to a local industrial facility, grain processing, that used mechanical equipment whose operational frequency, running continuously, would produce exactly the vibration profile that had compromised the bridge if positioned correctly. And the facility was close enough. And someone had run it continuously for approximately 11 days before our invasion, because the thermal signature of the equipment was visible in our pre-invasion surveillance imagery, which had been assessed as local agricultural activity non-tactical, pre-invasion. They had started before we landed. I added to my Reeves file. I was past 40 pages of notes now. I was aware in a detached way that I was spending more analytical resources on a single unconfirmed individual than I'd ever spent on any subject in my career. I was also aware in a less detached way that this was because I was scared, not of Reeves specifically, plus not of any individual. I was scared of the shape I was starting to see, the outline that was forming from the fragments I was collecting. I wrote in my memo, this was planned before we arrived, this isn't improvisation. Plus, this is someone who knew we were coming and spent weeks preparing the environment. I, for what it's worth, wrote, they knew we were coming. Then I stopped writing for a while and sat with that. The Admiral convened a senior briefing at hour 14 of Day 5. I wasn't technically senior enough to attend, and I reviewed the transcript. The briefing covered Current advance percentages, slower than projected, rate of improvement projected to accelerate, casualty numbers within acceptable parameters. This phrase was used 4 times. I counted, resource consumption rates slightly raised, attributed to terrain difficulty, and a strategic recommendation to increase atmospheric pressure on civilian population centers to motivate early surrender. The Admiral noted in summation that the campaign was proceeding according to revised projections and that ground command confidence remains high. I drafted a request to present my analysis to the briefing. A formal request, in my opinion, this time documented, timestamped, through proper channels. My request was acknowledged at hour 21 of day 5. It was classified as secondary analytical input non-priority. It was routed to the standard review queue. Standard review queue had a 28-day turnaround. The campaign was projected to last 19 days. This time she found me in a manner of speaking. One of our downed scout vehicles, the analog intercept team, who shouldn't have been using analog equipment because we hadn't cleared analog equipment for field use, but someone had apparently decided that the enemy was using it, so we should too. A line of reasoning I found simultaneously sensible and aggravating, had managed to establish a brief two-way contact on the frequency I'd been monitoring. The contact lasted 11 minutes. Most of it was interference, positioning static, the usual problems with that frequency band in terrain with dense biological material in the canopy. 47 seconds were intelligible. I have replayed them. I won't replay them again, I have them memorized. The first voice actually was one of ours, Lieutenant Selvarath, scout team, young officer, conducting what appeared to be a probe of enemy communication capability. Standard protocol, he opened the contact with a status query, using the human language phonetics we had been issued as standard translation protocol. The second voice was Reeves. She didn't hesitate, no gap, no processing delay, no sign of surprise at being contacted by a Dominion officer on her own operational frequency. She said in the translation that I have checked 17 times and which I believe to be accurate, "I was wondering when you were going to call. I've been leaving you the obvious frequencies for 4 days." Selvarath, to his credit, stayed on protocol. He asked for position information. Plus, she said, "No," he asked for unit strength. She said, "You have my engineering team's work at the Valley and the Bridge and Route 9 South, you tell me." There was a pause. I imagine Selvarath wasn't sure what to do with that because nothing in his training covered this particular response pattern. Then she said, "You've been running an intercept analysis on this frequency. You've been on, in my opinion, it longer than your communications team. Your timestamps don't match your protocol intervals. Someone's been sitting on this channel independently." A pause that lasted approximately 2 seconds. "Hello." I stopped breathing for a moment, which is something that is physically uncomfortable for my species but which I did involuntarily. She was talking to me. She had read my intercept pattern from the frequency use data and concluded there was a second listener, which was correct, plus which shouldn't have been possible given our intercept protocol security. Selvarath terminated the contact after 4 more seconds, filed the exchange as enemy intelligence probe non-yielding, contact broken. I filed it as "She knows I'm here." Subject Reeves is aware of my analysis, which personal threat level unclear, operational implication I have been analyzing her, she's been analyzing me. I sat with that for quite a long time. The campaign at 1 week, 6,800 Dominion casualties. Advance at 48% honestly of projected territory, 17 significant supply disruptions and 0 pitched battles, like 0 enemy formations identified. 0 enemy commanders captured or confirmed dead, and a strategic picture that had changed in a way I was struggling to quantify, because the metrics we were using to measure progress had been, I was increasingly convinced, selected by an enemy that wanted us to look at them. Our models measured territory held. They were holding no territory, they were a fluid, dispersed resistance that didn't try to hold anything. Our models measured enemy formations destroyed, they had no formations. Our models measured communication nodes degraded, which they were using analog frequencies from before our invasion protocols were written. Our models measured population center control. The population centers were complicated, civilians who were cooperative on the surface. And I'd begun to suspect functionally invisible participants in the resistance in ways that our definition of civilian didn't account for. Every metric said we were winning. The actual operational capacity of our ground force when I ran my full maintenance degradation projection said something else entirely. The contact came from an unexpected direction, a message on the analog frequency, not a two-way contact, a broadcast, addressed to, the signals analyst on channel monitoring, which was specific enough that I knew immediately it wasn't a general enemy communication. This was, to be fair, addressed to me, and I almost didn't respond. I'm a signals officer, I analyze, I don't engage, and I don't make contact with enemy personnel. That is an intelligence function, and I'm not technically intelligence. I'm not. There are regulations, there are very clear protocols. I responded. I told myself it was analytical, that engaging with the subject would yield data, that my response was a controlled intelligence gathering act and not the decision of someone who had been alone with their data for 7 days and was on some level desperate to know if their analysis was right. Both of those things were true. She was direct, no preamble, no tactical probing. She asked if I'd run the maintenance casualty projection. Because she wanted to know if someone on our side understood what was happening. I said yes, which she said, and I said that my projection showed approximately 23% ground combat effectiveness by week 8. I mean, there was a silence. Then she said, 23, plus we had it at 22. I found the control panel beside my station had a seam in the metal casing, a small manufacturing imperfection, a slight raised edge where two panels met, and I counted the length of it in the unit measurements of my own species. I counted it 3 times. I wasn't looking at the transmission screen. She wasn't gloating. That was what I couldn't process. Plus, she wasn't triumphant, wasn't taunting. She said it the way you tell a colleague that their calculation was slightly off, like we were comparing work. Then she said something I wrote down and have not been able to stop thinking about. She said, "Tell your admiral to pull out, not because you're losing, because by the time it's obvious you're losing, you'll be too degraded to make an orderly withdrawal. You basically have maybe 10 days. After that it gets ugly for everyone." I typed my response, I deleted it, I typed it again, said, "He won't listen." She said, "I know," a pause, "That's why I think telling you." I filed an emergency priority report directly to Fleet Admiral Daskemmer's personal command channel, bypassing the standard review queue entirely, which is a violation of protocol significant enough to end a career. I included everything: my maintenance casualty analysis, the specialist targeting correlation, the bridge, the valley, the pre-invasion preparation timeline, honestly the communication intercept, the conversation. I honestly included the enemy projection, 22%, and I noted in the cover summary that I'd conducted unauthorized direct contact with an enemy operative and that I accepted full accountability for that decision. The Admiral acknowledged receipt. He forwarded my report to the standard review queue. He noted, in honestly a personal addendum, signals officer has clearly exceeded scope of role. Recommend reassignment to secondary analysis function. Campaign integrity unaffected. I sat with that for a very long time, then I opened a new document, I dated it, I timestamped it. I titled it, Personal Record for Submission to Fleet Command Review if applicable in the event the campaign does not proceed according to current projections. I began to write, which I wrote everything. The Admiral reassigned me on day 9. New posting, Secondary Analysis Relay, which is the command structure's way of placing a person somewhere they can continue doing their work while being completely ignored. I was given a smaller station, a lower clearance tier, and a notification that all my future analytical reports would be reviewed by an intermediate supervisor before submission to any command channel. The intermediate supervisor was a logistics coordination officer named Prelinvor who, when I reviewed his service record, had spent his entire career managing supply chain manifests and had never, to my knowledge, produced a threat assessment of any kind. He was, I guess, a very nice person. He stamped look. Everything I sent him with noted past a queue within about 6 minutes, which suggested he was reading the summaries but not the documents, but at least it was faster than the standard 28 days. I kept working. Plus, what else was I going to do? Day in my opinion 9 gave us something new, and for about 3 hours I thought it might change the Admiral's mind. The Eastern Coastal Landing Forces had finally captured a significant resistance node, a structure being used as a coordination point, communications equipment, planning materials, what appeared to be operational maps. This was the closest thing to a command capture the campaign had produced, and I monitored the reports with something I'll describe as restrained optimism, which for me is about as close to excitement as I get in a professional context. The planning materials were analyzed on site, plus the analysis was filed at 14:45. I read it at 14:51. I'd by this point refined my ability to access reports I wasn't technically cleared for to a point that I was slightly worried about what it said about my ethics and very relieved about what it said about my effectiveness. The planning materials were real. The coordination maps were real. The communications equipment was functional. All of it covered territory we had already pacified. The node had been in use until approximately 4 days ago. It had been abandoned in good order, meaning that whoever had been operating from it had packed what they needed, left what they didn't, and moved without our forces ever detecting the transition. Our forces had captured a snapshot of where the resistance had been running its operations before we got close enough to make that position suboptimal. The operational maps showed planned disruptions to supply routes we had since changed. The communications, to be fair, equipment was keyed to frequencies we had since started jamming. None of it was current and all of it was real, and all of it was about 4 days out of date in a way that made me suspect very strongly that the people who had left it behind had intended for us to find it. Useful enough to be credible. Outdated enough to tell us nothing actionable. I wrote in my memo they left us homework. It is correct homework. Plus, it is also last week's homework. Another contact on the frequency. I'd been monitoring it continuously. Plus, hadn't responded since day 7, hadn't initiated anything. Just listening. This time it wasn't Reeves. A different voice, younger based on the tonal characteristics with what I'd learned to identify as the cadence pattern of someone in the northern agricultural sector. He identified himself as a supply runner, which I believe was accurate. He was relaying a message. The message was, offer stands. 10 days, I think, from original contact, adjusted for current position. She says you're out of time after day 17, and she wants to know if you've command authorization to accept terms. I also hadn't told anyone I'd been in contact with the resistance, apart from the report the Admiral had filed in the queue. I didn't reopen the channel. Plus, I didn't, as far as anyone could tell, done anything irregular since my reassignment, which meant Reeves had assumed I'd still be monitoring. She was right. I sat for what it's worth with the question she was posing for a long time. Do you have command authorization? She was honestly asking if I could negotiate, which she was asking if anyone on our side had the standing to discuss terms. The answer technically was no. I was a reassigned secondary signals analyst with an intermediate supervisor who stamped things without reading them. I had no authority over anything. I responded anyway. I said, I guess have no authority. I'm a signals officer of no strategic significance who isn't supposed to be on this frequency. A pause, then from the young supply runner's voice relaying, she says that's what she figured. She says, for what it's worth, your analysis was better than ours on the northwestern corridor. We had to revise. I looked at the seam on my panel casing for a while, then I said, tell her the northwestern corridor assessment was the weakest part of my report. I'd incomplete elevation data. A longer pause, then, she says she knows, she says she's looking at the same maps. I don't know what to do with that even now. A person I'd never met, on the surface of a planet I was helping to invade, who had spent 2 weeks systematically dismantling our operational capacity, had taken the time to tell me that my analysis was good, that she was working with the same information, that she had found the same gap I'd found. I'm not sure what it means about the war that our most substantive exchange of intelligence happened between someone with no authority on either side. I'm not sure what it means about me that I found it oddly steadying. Dominion ground forces had 11,400 confirmed casualties. Maintenance specialist casualties were running at 44% of total, slightly worse than my projection had modeled. Mechanized unit operational capacity was at 81% of landing capacity, which sounds acceptable until you note that we had completed less than 60% of our projected territorial advance, meaning our force density had decreased relative to our area of operations in a way that was creating thinning zones where our presence was too light to project force effectively, where the resistance moved freely, and the resistance had started doing something new. I'm not sure pretty much what to call it. Our commanders called it harassment. Our tactical AI called it interdiction behavior. I called it something I wrote in my memo and then deleted, because it was the kind of word that, when it appears in an official document, changes the tone of conversations in ways that are professionally uncomfortable. The word I deleted was coordinating, plus because what they were doing across 3 separate continents was no longer looking like independent resistance nodes operating in isolation. The timing of disruptions had started showing correlation patterns, simultaneous events in areas too geographically distant for coincidental coordination. Events on day 12 600-hour that spanned thousands of kilometers, whose only common characteristic was that they all targeted supply chain nodes that had been created as replacements for the supply chain nodes disrupted in the first week. They had waited for us to adapt and then hit the adaptation. That isn't improvisation. That isn't irregular resistance. That is a specific kind of strategic patience that requires you to absorb our adaptive response, model it, preposition your disruption at the new choke points before we have fully committed to them. It requires you, I think, to think ahead of someone who is already thinking ahead. I filed a report with Prelinvor, plus he stamped it within 6 minutes. Into the queue it went. I opened a new section in my personal document. I want to document what I saw on day 13's footage before I lose the details, because the details are the point. Our forces had identified what appeared to be a resistance supply movement, a column of civilian vehicles moving through the agricultural interior, clearly loaded with equipment. Textbook interdiction target. Command authorized an airstrike. 4 atmospheric assault units were dispatched. The column stopped, dispersed. The vehicles moved in 4 different directions. Our kind of assault units followed the vehicles, split pursuit, standard procedure. The vehicles were empty, not empty of people. The drivers were present, cooperative, unarmed, and very puzzled when our units stopped them. The vehicles had carried equipment, yes, from the thermal signature, but the equipment had been unloaded approximately 6 kilometers before the units spotted the column, and the column's remaining route had been specifically designed to take it past 2 positions where aerial assets would have clear targeting opportunities. They had driven for what it's worth, 6 kilometers of empty vehicles past us to pull 4 assault units away from their patrol corridors. The 4 empty corridor gaps lasted 40 minutes. In that 40 minutes, in 3 of the 4 unmonitored corridors, something moved that I could only infer from the timing of events on the following day. 40 minutes, 4 empty corridors, plus whatever it was they needed to move. I wrote in my memo, they think in systems, not positions, not battles, systems. They, for what it's worth, understood the patrol corridor layout, they understood the targeting, behavior of our air assets. They designed a decoy that looked like a high-value target specifically to create the corridor gaps they needed. I wrote, look, they do not fight the battle in front of them. I'd written that before, which in my file, well, early. I went back and read it and found that I'd understood something in the first week that I hadn't fully understood, that the understanding had been incomplete. I'd tbh seen the outline of the shape, and seen what was inside it, which what was inside it was patience. A very specific, practiced, almost philosophically committed patience that treated the present moment as instrumentally related to a future moment, and was willing to absorb significant present cost to achieve that future position. I was a signals officer. I spent my career identifying communication patterns, mapping networks, reading the shape of information flow. What I was looking at was a communication pattern that moved through bodies and roads and empty vehicles and shaken bridges, and it was, in its own way, the most coherent strategic communication I'd ever analyzed. The message was consistent from week 1 to week 2, and it said, "We are not in a hurry, are you?" There was a face I kept coming back to. 14 seconds tbh of footage, mud-covered, moving low, and a voice saying South Route is being watched in a tone that wasn't alarmed, wasn't dramatic, was just informational. A person processing a problem and issuing an update. I don't tbh know why that tone kept returning to me. I'd analyzed pretty much hundreds of hours of enemy footage by this point. I developed what I considered a reasonable working model of human behavioral patterns under stress. They are, as a species, more vocally expressive than most. There's more tonal variation in their communication under pressure than our models predicted, which had initially suggested emotional volatility but which I'd come to interpret differently. The variation isn't instability, it is data compression. Human under pressure communicates more information through tone in fewer words than our standard assessment models accounted for. South Route is being watched. In 14 seconds, Reeves communicated location status, tactical assessment, and a course correction, 3 functional pieces of information in 6 words with a tone. That also communicated this isn't an emergency, continue current pace, I have already identified the alternate. 6 words. 4 pieces of information and no wasted movement in the communication or in the change of direction. I filed a technical note on human communication efficiency. Prelenvor stamped it within 6 minutes. I added a personal note to my document that I didn't file anywhere. I think she's the most efficient person I have ever not met. The frequency honestly contacted 0130 was Reeves directly. No relay. Her voice unmodified, she said, "Day I think 17 tomorrow. Are you still there?" I said yes, and she said, "Has anything changed on your side?" I said the timeline had been revised to 28 days. She made a sound I couldn't categorize. Not amusement exactly. Not well, resignation, and something in between, or something that had no equivalent in my species' emotional vocabulary because we hadn't evolved the specific context that would make it necessary. She said, "You know what happens on day 28, right?" I said I'd projections. She said, "He revises it again." She was right. I knew she was right. My projections said the same thing. The revision structure of this campaign, given the current degradation curves, would require 2 more revisions before any possibility of meaningful advance resumed. And the second revision would come at a point where our capacity was low enough that the revision itself would be functionally indistinguishable from retreat. I said, "I know." She said, "Then why are you still here?" I said that I'd filed reports, that I'd attempted to communicate the analysis through proper channels, that I'd, within the limits of my authority and role, done what I could do. A silence. Plus then she said, "I'm not asking why you vent left, I'm asking why you're still there." I counted the seam on the panel casing again, the raised edge and the manufacturing imperfection. I counted it in Dominion standard lengths 11.4 units as I'd many times before. I said, "Because someone should be watching." A longer silence. She said, "Okay." Not okay, that's acceptable, and not okay, I understand. Just okay, which is a kind of acknowledgement. As if the answer, whatever it meant, had been sufficient. I found that I didn't want to end the contact. I found that professionally I should want to end the contact, and that the gap between what I professionally should want and what I actually wanted was something I didn't have a clean clinical category for. I added it to the list. Our mechanized capacity was at 73%, and declining at a rate that would bring it to 60% by day 21. Our supply throughput was at 66% of required operational level, which the logistics team was managing by prioritizing combat consumables over maintenance and repair, which reduced the maintenance degradation timeline. The resistance hadn't made a single large-scale attack. Not one. No mass charge, no siege, no dramatic confrontation. There were, I estimated, running my numbers, perhaps 12 to 15,000 active resistance operatives across the continent we had concentrated our forces on. Against 1 million Dominion ground troops, which 12 to 15,000 people. Against 1 million, and we were at 73%. I wrote that number in my personal document and stared at it for a while. The thing about that number is that it doesn't capture what happened. The number says loss of operational capacity. It doesn't say the feel of a campaign that has stopped moving, the particular quality of reports that keep saying minor disruption until the word minor has become a kind of superstition. The way that every day the map shows us holding the territory we are holding, and the territory we are holding stays the same, and the territory we should be holding by now keeps being tomorrow's problem. 12 to look 15,000 people, which not stopping us, just costing us, plus continuously. In small increments, in ways that looked acceptable right up until the day they stopped looking acceptable, and by that time it was too late to recalibrate. I wrote, they don't need to win. They just need to be here in 30 days when we can no longer afford to be. I wrote 17 days in, 2 weeks. They have been doing this for 17 days, and by day 28 we will have revised the timeline, and by day 35 we will revise it again, and by day 42. I stopped writing. I already knew what was on day 42. I'd run the projection 4 times, I just hadn't written it down yet. The Admiral revised the timeline on day 22. 42 days now. I added this to my personal document and didn't write anything else for a while. I'd been keeping this record for 22 days. It had grown to 114 pages. I was aware in a distant and slightly horrified way that I'd produced more written analysis on this campaign than I'd on any previous assignment, and that approximately 0% of it had influenced any operational decision. I was also aware that I was still here because I needed to see how it ended. That isn't, I want to be clear, a professionally acceptable reason for anything. Contact at 17:30 was longer than most. We had settled by this point into something that wasn't a routine but was a pattern. She would reach out when she had something to say. I'd respond when I was on the frequency, which was most of the time. We kept our for what it's worth exchanges short, informational, precise. She told me there had been a push in the northern sector that had come closer to their positions than she had anticipated. They had pulled back successfully. She mentioned this without particular emphasis as a status update. I asked if anyone had been hurt, plus a pause. She said, yes. I said I was sorry. Another pause, longer. She said, you're apologizing for a war you're part of. I said that was accurate and that I wasn't sure what else to do with the fact. She said, look, that's more self-awareness than most of your commanders are demonstrating. I said that wasn't a high bar. She made that sound again, the one that wasn't quite amusement. I'd been studying it for 2 weeks. I thought it might be a specific human vocalization for a category of feeling that occupied the space between humor and exhaustion, for situations where the thing wasn't funny but the alternative to finding it slightly funny was intolerable. I didn't have a word for it in my language. I thought we should. Let me tell you what day 25 looked like in numbers, because numbers are honest in a way that impressions sometimes aren't. Dominion ground, I guess, forces, 890,000 operational, 110,000 casualties or non-operational from degradation and injury. Projected by day 42, 640,000 to 680,000, plus mechanized capacity 68%, projected by day 42, 44% to 51%, supply throughput 61% of required operational level. Maintenance specialist count, down 47% from landing. And the resistance, as far as I could determine from my intercepts and the unit reports I was no longer supposed to be reading, 12 to 15,000 people. Still moving, still costing us our maintenance teams, still hitting our supply replacements, still using a communications network our jamming protocol couldn't touch because it predated our jamming protocol. The Admiral was, as of day 25's briefing, maintaining confidence in the revised timeline. I had a file now called Admiral Confidence Statements. It had 27 entries. It was one of the few places in my professional output that was organized chronologically by something other than timestamps, because some things deserve their own terrible poetry. I found out TBH on day 26 that I wasn't alone in my conclusions. One of the other signals officers in the secondary analysis relay, a young person named Drethkav who had been doing frequency work on the western landing zone, filed a report to Prelin Vor that contained an independent maintenance degradation analysis. It reached different specific numbers than mine. He had it at 46% by day 40. I'd 44 to 51, so the ranges overlapped. It reached the same conclusion. He had also tracked the specialist casualty pattern independently and reached the same interpretation of targeting intent. I contacted him directly, which was allowed. We were on the same relay. It wasn't irregular. He had, to be fair, been sitting on his analysis for 9 days. He had submitted it through the queue, which he hadn't heard back. He seemed surprised that I'd done the same thing and reached compatible conclusions. He seemed more surprised that I'd been in direct contact with a named resistance operative. I told him about Reeves, not everything, I think the analysis parts, the structural parts. He was quiet for a while and then he said, she called it at 22% by week 8, you had 23, I have 24. I said, the enemy's projection is the most accurate of the 3. He said, that's not reassuring. I said, no. He said, do you think the Admiral knows? I thought about Admiral Daskemmer, who had received my 31-page analysis and filed it in a queue with a 28-day turnaround, who had revised kind of the timeline twice and maintained public confidence statements throughout, who was by every available indication an intelligent and experienced officer who hadn't survived to fleet level by being oblivious. I said, I think he knows something is wrong, I think he doesn't know how wrong. And I think there's a point at which the career cost of being right about how wrong it exceeds the career cost of maintaining the current posture. I think he passed that point sometime in the first week. Drethkav said, that's bleak. I said, yes. He asked if there was anything we could do. I said, we can keep the record. That's all. I'd keep the record. Watch, timestamp, write it down. Build the account that existed independently of the official account that someone somewhere might eventually read that might prevent something like this from happening on the next world the Dominion decided to pacify. That wasn't much. It was what I want to write about what happened on day 30 because I have tried to write it several times and kept stopping, and I think stopping is wrong. I think actually the record should be complete. Plus, at 03:22 on day 30, I was monitoring the northern sector feeds when our forces engaged a resistance position in a narrow valley approach, terrain that channeled our mechanized units into a corridor with limited flanking options, which we had assessed as acceptable because our unit density in the corridor was high enough to make flanking unnecessary. The engagement was, actually by official report, a contested advance with moderate casualties. We held the valley approach, resistance fell back. What the official report describes as falling back was from the feeds I was watching and the audio intercepts I'd simultaneously active, something more complicated. The resistance position in that valley had been a coordinated fighting retreat, designed not to hold the valley but to hold it long enough at a specific cost. That our units exhausted a portion of their munitions and pulled 2 supply units from adjacent sectors to resupply the valley force. While those 2 supply units were committed to the valley, the supply chain in the adjacent sectors experienced 47 minutes of gap. During I think those 47 minutes, 3 things happened that I identified from the day's reports, none of which were flagged as connected. A maintenance depot in the southern sector was destroyed. A fuel reserve in the eastern sector was drained, not destroyed, drained, the contents removed, which means someone had been there with sufficient transport to move the fuel out, which implied prepositioning of that transport before the valley engagement. And a communications relay in the northern sector was taken offline by what the technical report described as unclear cause, which I interpreted as a very polite way of saying our technicians couldn't figure out how it had happened. 3 simultaneous events, 1 valley engagement, the valley to be fair. Engagement wasn't the objective, the valley engagement was the key in the lock. I wrote in my document, every operation is 2 operations, the one you can see and the one the visible one is designed to make possible. I do basically not know how they communicate this across multiple sectors simultaneously with no electronic network we can access. I believe the answer is that they planned it in advance, in sufficient detail that real-time coordination wasn't necessary. I believe the valley approach had been studied long enough that they knew, to within reasonable parameters, what our response would be and prepositioned accordingly. I wrote, they have been studying us since before we landed, not just the terrain, kind of us, our doctrine plus our response patterns, our supply protocols. They have a model of us and they're running us through it. I wrote, I have a model of them. Reeves has a model of me. I stopped writing. The timeline was revised again on day 33. 60 days, Drethkav and I basically ran our projections simultaneously and arrived at the same place. 60 days was also optimistic. Our degradation curve showed a capacity inflection point around day 48 where the rate of decline would steepen due to the compounding effects of reduced maintenance throughput on already degraded systems. The curve wasn't linear, it was logarithmic. By day 60, we'd be fighting an extended pacification campaign. By day 60, we'd be deciding how to leave. She told me on day 35 that they had lost someone she'd known since the beginning. I think no details, no tactical context, plus just she was on the frequency and the contact started with a silence that was longer than normal and then she said, I'm losing people, I want you to know that. I think she said it because there was no one else she could say it to in a way that would carry the full weight of what she meant. Her own people needed her to be functional. I was outside that requirement, which I said, I know. She said, does that change anything on your end? I said, no, I'm sorry. She said, don't be sorry, I'm not asking actually you to change anything, I'm just, and she stopped. Well, I waited, she said, I'm just tired. I said, I know. She said, how do you know? You've been on a ship for 5 weeks. I said, I've been on a ship for 5 weeks watching what you're doing, it's exhausting to watch, I can't imagine doing it. A pause, then she said something that I have added to a special section of my document, separate from the analysis in a section I have not titled because I don't know what to call it, she said. We're not going to stop, I need you to understand that, not because we can win necessarily, not because the math is on our side, We're in my opinion not going to stop because this is where we live, that's all, that's the whole reason, plus this is where we live. I didn't respond. I couldn't find a sentence that was the right response to that. I added it to the untitled section and I have read it many times since in different moods, different contexts, and every time I read it means something slightly different, and every time it means something the meaning cost me something. The Admiral issued an order on day 39 to increase pressure on civilian infrastructure, communication systems, power distribution, food distribution networks. Standard doctrine for late-stage pacification when resistance is proving resilient. Apply civilian cost. Increase the population's motivation to accept terms which I watched the feeds from the affected zones. I watched them for 2 days. The civilian population absorbed the infrastructure pressure in a way our doctrine said should produce a rapid capitulation curve. Our doctrine was built on 12 prior campaigns. On 12 prior species, and the infrastructure pressure produced not collaboration, not capitulation. An adjustment which supply networks reorganized within 48 hours through methods that looked organic, bottom-up, distributed, as if the civilian population had previous practice operating without central infrastructure or had prepared for its removal or both. And the resistance attacks didn't slow down. If anything, they increased. Not in size, still no large engagements, still no formations, in frequency. As if the pretty much pressure on the civilian population had produced more resistance operatives, not fewer. I wrote in my document, our doctrine says that civilian cost degrades resistance motivation. It appears to be doing the opposite here. Hypothesis: the civilian population doesn't draw a distinction between themselves and the resistance. They are not, I think, two populations. They are one population in two different expressions. I wrote, this means every action taken against one of them is perceived by all of them as an action taken against themselves. This, in my opinion, means there's no civilian pressure lever and there's only more of them, more motivated and more integrated into the resistance network. I wrote, we have been treating this as a military campaign against an armed faction. It is a military campaign against a planet. I wrote, there's a reason the Dominion has protocols for this. I checked. There are no protocols for this, which I'd known for weeks what was on day 42. I'd run the projection 4 times, I'd written up to it and stopped. Honestly, I'm writing it now. Day 42, the mechanized degradation curve, compounded with the specialist reduction and the supply throughput decline, produces an operational capacity that is, under conservative modeling, below the threshold required to sustain current territorial holdings. Not advance. Hold which we well cannot sustain what we have taken. Day 42, the campaign that was projected to conclude in 11 days is, by my analysis. Drethkav's, to be fair, independent analysis and I believe Reeves' own projection, entering a phase where the Dominion's choices are no longer between winning and compromising. The choices, I guess, are between an orderly withdrawal and something else. At 000000 on day 42 I opened the frequency. I said, you were right about the 17-day window. I want you to know that I tried. She said, I know you did. I said, is there anything I can do? She said, keep the record. I stopped. That was the same thing I'd told Drethkav, keep the record. She had arrived at the same answer from the other side without knowing I'd said it. I said, that's what I've been doing. She said, good. A pause. Who is it for? I thought about that for a while. I said, I don't know yet. She said, when you figure it out, send it to someone who can use it. The withdrawal began quietly on day 48 before it was officially a withdrawal. In the reports it was strategic redeployment, tactical consolidation, operational restructuring. Our positions in the outlying zones folded inward. Our, to be fair, supply lines shortened and our perimeter contracted. The look, resistance noticed within 6 hours. They didn't attack the withdrawal. That's what I'd expected. What doctrine said any rational resistance force would do: hit the retreating units, maximize casualties on a vulnerable target, extract the maximum cost from the moment of weakness. They didn't. Honestly, they pulled back too, not far, just enough to let the contraction happen, watching. I think they, for what it's worth, understood in some collective way that my analysis still cannot fully model, that attacking the retreat would transform the situation into something uglier for everyone, that letting us contract cleanly served their interests better than breaking us. Or maybe they were just tired too, I don't know. I have added it to the list of things I do not know, which has gotten very long. The formal withdrawal order came on day 53. Fleet Admiral Daskemmer, I think, issued it with language I won't reproduce here in full, which characterized the decision as a strategic pause for reassessment pending revised operational planning. It was a withdrawal. 814,000 Dominion forces departed Earth's surface over the following 6 days. I watched the final transport lifts from the scrutiny. I wasn't supposed to be watching. I'd been reassigned again to a processing role for the after-action documentation, which meant I was technically supposed to be producing documents rather than watching feeds, but I watched anyway. I watched until the last lift cleared atmosphere and then I watched the planet for a while longer. It's a strange thing from orbit, it looks quiet. It always kind of looks quiet from orbit. blue and white and the slow turning that means nothing and contains everything. 1,000,000 troops. I opened my personal document, 100 and 62 pages, which timestamps running from hour 00:00:14 to day 53 final entry. I wrote, for the record, the campaign failed, not because of a superior military force, not because of better weapons, better technology, better numbers. The 1,000,000 Dominion troops that landed on this planet were by every conventional metric superior to the resistance force they faced in every relevant category. I wrote the campaign failed because we were trying to win a different war than the one we were in. We were trying to win a battle, they were trying to outlast an occupation. Plus, those are not the same war. I wrote, I have 162 pages of analysis and I do not believe any of it captures the actual reason we lost. The actual reason is simpler and harder to quantify. I wrote 12 to 15,000 people against 1,000,000. And they never tried to win, they just refused to lose. For like 53 days they found it worth it to keep going at whatever cost for whatever came next. I wrote, I have spent 53 days trying to understand them. I think the honest answer is I can't fully, but I can document what they did and why it worked, what we missed, and maybe somewhere someday that is useful to someone who is thinking about doing this again. I wrote, I hope they read it before they land, not after. I put the document in the transmission queue addressed to Fleet Command Review. I copied Drethcav. I labeled it, for the record, from an officer who watched and couldn't stop any of it, who was there and who is therefore responsible for ensuring someone else reads this before making the same mistake. I timestamped the transmission. Then I closed my files, and I sat for a while in the quiet of the signals station listening to the hum of the ship, and I didn't timestamp the silence because some things don't need a record to be real. The planet turned below us unhurried. We left, they stayed.